So sometimes we want to protect ourselves from having to cope with bad outcomes, from putting ourselves out there and then being disappointed, stuff like that. We call that pessimism. Defensive pessimism. So, in this approach or this style that we might have, we set low expectations for our future performance despite having done well in similar situations in the past. Now, I talked about this in another lecture where I talked about self handicapping and sandbagging. Sandbagging is that subset of self handicapping where we try and manage other people's expectations for us. So we say, well, I haven't practiced in a while. Um, you know, I'm out of condition. Stuff like that, so that we can kind of manage people's expectations. Well, I'm not really familiar with this particular computer, but I'm sure I can figure it out. Something like that. So we're managing other people's expectations. In I don't know why I keep calling it defensive pessimism, we are doing it almost as a like Freudian defense mechanism is what the defensiveness means in this term. And so what we're trying to do is convince ourselves. We're not trying to just sandbag and manage other people's expectations. We're actually managing our own expectations. We're trying to lower our own bar so that if we're successful, the bar will have been lower. It's more a higher probability of success because we'll probably exceed our defensively pessimistic prediction. So it helps to cushion the blow of possible failure. Right? We've lowered the bar a little bit so it makes it less likely that we might have to fail. We also cushion the blow of possible failure by having reminded ourselves, I haven't practiced in a while. I'm not familiar with this computer, right? We remind ourselves. Or remember the example I gave a couple chapters ago, I think, where I talked about how people who are shy oftentimes will mention that right before they go to do a performance. They'll say, well, I'm pretty shy. I don't do well in front of people. That way, if I choke, I can say, well, I told you I'm pretty shy and that really was overwhelming and I really couldn't do it, right? It helps to cushion the blow because I said out loud the expectations. I said out loud, this might be a problem. So by focusing attention, our own attention, other people's attention on the problems that might be encountered, it allows us to be able to say, I told you I wasn't very good at that, or I told me I wasn't very good at that. But it also has a benefit like a direct like improvement of performance kind of benefit if we point out the problems. Because if I say I haven't practiced in a while, and then I'm going to, I don't know, try and play the piano that I haven't practiced in a while, maybe I'm going to take a couple breaths before I try. Or maybe I'll say, I haven't practiced in a while, let me do some scales real quickly before I start. Do something to actually make it more likely that I might succeed. So by acknowledging the shortcomings, by acknowledging that there are blocks to my performance, I might actually take steps that would improve my performance. So, see that extra benefit of defensive I can't say it. Defensive pessimism is what I want it to be for some reason. Defensive pessimism. So, it may actually by us sort of, even if we don't say it out loud, but we've sort of said it inside of our own head, it may take cause us to take steps to make sure that those shortcomings don't come to fruition. So we might over prepare. I'm really shy, I have to give a speech. Maybe I'll practice the speech even more to the point of over learning so that when I go to do the speech, all the nervousness doesn't overtake my ability to actually give the speech. So working really hard to prepare for the situation might overcome the very thing that I'm worried about happening, right? We might acknowledge all of our anxiety and use that as a motivator. Um, if you are if you are feeling optimistic and not aware of the things that might undermine your performance, you might just try and take your mind off of the things that could lead to anxiety. You might be like, you know what, I need to put that out of my mind. That's just going to distract me. That I don't want to think about that. I'm just going to go out there and I'm going to do the best I can. I know my performance can be good. I'm just going to do it. And a person who's experiencing defensive pessimism will say to themselves, I feel that anxiety. I feel that fear of failure. I'm going to go ahead and take some steps to make sure it doesn't come to fruition. So you use that anxiety as a motivator, whereas a person who's experiencing optimism might not. They might just try and put it out of their heads. Depending on the task, putting it out of your head may be fine. Like if you've over practiced this task and you really can do it and you're just feeling jitters at the last minute and there's no reason to like go back and practice some more because you already did the work, that optimism makes sense. Put it out of your mind. What you need to focus on right now is really how to manage that anxiety because that's the problem. It's not your underpreparedness or something like that. But if on the other hand, which is the case in a lot of our situations, we really are not adequately prepared, it can be really motivating to be really holding in your mind the possibility of failure. Like that makes us say, I don't want that to happen and I'm going to practice or I'm going to study or I'm going to do what it would take to make sure that that thing I'm so scared of doesn't happen. So, to wrap up this issue of defensive pessimism, it's probably really helpful in a lot of ways, right? It probably helps to motivate us. It probably helps us to perform better than we would otherwise. Um, it can be problematic, especially if you have already done the work and you have already gotten prepared and you are ready to go. And if you're still telling yourself, I don't know, I probably can't, that's when we're starting to move out of defensive pessimism and into just pessimism. So keep those things separate, just as much as we were talking about keeping naive optimism away from realistic optimism. All right, now this is an area of positive psychology that sometimes people get, um, I want to say defensive about, or they want to question a lot. And that's the association between religiosity and health. People who have higher scores on religiosity scales, so these are people who answer questions like, I attend religious services more frequently, or um, I am involved in my place of worship even when it's not for religious services. Like I go there for meetings, or I go there to help with things, or I'm really, like more intricately involved in that religious organization than the average person who just comes for services. Or a person who reports that they've had times when they really feel like um, their religious figure has actually intervened in their life, like they have felt it like that. These are people who tend to score higher on a religiosity scale. I'm not talking about any particular religion. I'm not talking about anything like that. I'm talking about people who have that sense of belief. And there's been research that has shown that some people carry a gene that when it's turned on, they tend to be more religious. And other people, when that same gene is turned off, they tend to be less religious. So it might be that some of us are just biologically predisposed to be more religious or not. And I'm not talking about the acts of any particular religion. I'm talking about this belief system that they're engaged in. Okay, so I wanted to make sure that it was really clear that this is based on research data that I'm saying talking about here. So you notice that this is the life expectancy on the y-axis and then the frequency of religious attendance on the x, which that doesn't tell you anything about how much they adhere to the premises of their religion or anything. It just tells you how often they go. And what you see is that the more often a person goes, the longer their life expectancy. And it's a nice, pretty decent line. It looks like there's not a ton of difference between like weekly and more than weekly, or between less than weekly and weekly. Certainly there appears to be a shorter lifespan among those with the never go to church or religious services versus those who go. So religiosity seems to be associated with a longer life. I'm still like, don't know what to make of that yet. Let's keep going. Here's the risk of dying relative to others, and then based on some risk factors. And the blue bars are males and the red bars are females. So people who don't smoke, so this is the risk of dying relative to others. People who don't smoke have a lower risk of dying. People who regularly exercise have a lower risk of dying. But when people attend weekly religious services, you see a difference also. Some people have argued that maybe people who attend religious services also don't smoke, and factors like that, there can be confounds present in this, overlapping variables and things like that. But notice that for men in particular, I sorry, for women in particular, because having a smaller bar is better in this particular graph. So your risk of dying relative to others, 100% would be I have an equal risk of dying compared to other people. The lower the bar is away from 100%, the lower the risk, right? So particularly for females, like for males, exercising and religious service seem to have the same amount of benefit. For females, weekly attendance at a religious service seems to have a better benefit than exercising. So, what is going on with that, right? Some have pointed to the social support that occurs in attending weekly religious service. So, maybe that's the factor, and it doesn't really matter whether it's religion or not. Well, just in case you were thinking those thoughts, there have been studies where they've looked at religious involvement and then tried to see if you held steady some different variables that could be the explanation for why the religious involvement is having this effect on better health. So holding it steady means we're going to compare people who are equal in these characteristics. So we would look at like people who are involved in their religious group versus those who are not, and then let's say smoked at the same rate or drank alcohol at the same rate. Like we would hold that variable steady and look to see whether religious involvement was still the best explanation. So they did that for all of these different variables to see if there was something else that was a better explanation than religious involvement. And what the researchers are concluding is that religious involvement oftentimes leads to these better behaviors, honestly, these healthier behaviors, which then in turn lead to the better health. So if you just do the behaviors, it probably would have the same effect as if you do the behaviors because you're being led toward it by your religious involvement. But notice down here on the bottom, positive emotions, hope, optimism, are associated with better health. We already talked about the immune system functioning. Lower levels of stress hormones are present in people who tend to experience more hope and optimism. And one of the things about religious involvement is that it tends to give people more hope and optimism. It gives them messages about maybe there is a plan for your life. It gives them, in some religions, gives you hope about what happens in the afterlife, right? There are a lot of messages that give people hope. And so you can imagine why religious involvement may lead to these positive emotions, which then could lead to the benefits that we see on the better health. So, so this is the path that we think happens with religious involvement. 75% of longevity difference remains after controlling for healthy behaviors. So if we take healthy behaviors like smoking and drinking out of the equation, we still have 75% of the difference between people who attend religious services and people who don't left explaining better health. Like healthy behaviors doesn't explain it. So if you've at all been thinking about attending religious services or whatever, and you're like, I'm not sure, I have some negative attitudes about it, whatever, it's possible that it could have an effect on things downstream. It's possible. I don't know. I'm not suggesting anything specific. I'm just saying that it's possible because 75% of the difference in lifespan is still better attributed to religious attendance than it is to any of the other factors. Now, I wanted to point out that positive psychology is not new. It feels new because it had such a flurry of activity right around the turn of our last century, right? Like 1998 to 2016. It was really a hot, flourishing field. So a lot of people thought, well, this is new, but it's not new. Look at this quote. Sit all day in a moping posture, sigh and reply to everything with a dismal voice, and your melancholy lingers. If we wish to conquer undesirable emotional tendencies in ourselves, we must go through the outward movements of those contrary dispositions which we prefer to cultivate. This was in the first English language psychology textbook written in 1890 by William James. So these concepts of, holding positive attitudes, behaving in positive ways is not new. This has been the perspective of the field of psychology for the entire time. We had some digressions. Freud came along and said all these negative things are what are motivating people. The behaviorists came along and said, oh, external factors can treat you like a puppet and make you behave in ways that you don't plan on behaving, stuff like that. But at the heart, this has been like the basis of psychology forever. And so I really wanted to I feel like that's a message of hope. Like this has been psychology its whole time. So that's why I stuck it into this chapter because it feels like, this message of hope that if you fake it till you make it, that if you act like a person who's experiencing optimism, if you act like a person who has hope, that ultimately you will be a person who has optimism, that ultimately you will be a person who has hope. So that's the message that I think William James sent us, more than 100 years ago. All right, well, this is the end of hope, so I will see you in the next chapter.